The inciting incident. It was a chaotic rush hour in Atlanta. Caleb Johnson, a seasoned bus driver in his mid-50s, found himself halted at a red light. Suddenly, a car erupted in flames in the middle of the street. Ignoring the angry shouts and protests from his passengers, he instinctively rushed out to save the trapped driver. This selfless act cost him his job. What he couldn't have known was that the young man he rescued would ultimately transform his life, pulling him into a new world where his worth would not only be recognized but where he'd help reshape the very system that had cast him aside. At 5:45 p.m., downtown Atlanta was a symphony of blaring horns and snarled traffic, the summer heat pressing down like a heavy blanket. Inside bus number 214, Caleb's back ached from a grueling 12-hour shift. At 55, his face, etched with quiet resilience, bore the marks of decades. His uniform was worn, but his posture remained upright, alert. He'd navigated these streets for over 30 years, intimately familiar with their pulse and their people. And he knew with a chilling certainty when something was terribly wrong. Approaching the intersection of Peachtree and 14th, the light shifted to red. That's when he saw it. A silver coupe, mangled against a concrete median. Steam billowed, then smoke, then hungry flames. The driver was slumped, unmoving. Fire licked greedily at the car's underside, beginning its climb. Pedestrians recorded on their phones, cars honked, some screamed. But no one moved. Caleb didn't hesitate. He slammed the brake, flicked on the hazards and stood. "What the hell are you doing?" a voice barked from the rear. "You can't just leave," another shouted. "I've got a flight to catch. Man, I'm already late for my shift. You better not leave this damn bus." Caleb briefly turned to face them. Their panic was palpable, but so was the fire and the man trapped inside. "I'll be just a minute," he stated, his voice calm and firm. "There's someone in that vehicle." He didn't wait for a reply, stepping into the humid air and sprinting towards the inferno. Behind him, the bus erupted. "You selfish bastard. Is he crazy? Call 311. Get him fired. Let's get off this piece of junk. This ain't worth it." The scene outside was pure pandemonium. Flames were now engulfing the car's interior. Caleb dashed back to the bus, grabbed the emergency glass hammer and charged the sedan. The searing heat scorched his face as he shattered the driver's window and reached inside. The man, a white male in his early 30s, lay unconscious, blood trickling from his temple. Smoke clawed at Caleb's throat, but he held on, dragging the limp body through the jagged window, glass tearing at his arms. The heat became unbearable. Something under the hood popped with a hiss and a shower of sparks. He pressed on. 20 feet. That's how far he carried the man to safety before gently lowering him onto the sidewalk. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Caleb stumbled back towards the bus, blood now seeping through his uniform sleeve. The situation had devolved into chaos. Half the passengers had exited, angrily waving their arms as they stomped down the street, attempting to hail cabs or summon ride shares. One man pointed directly at Caleb, yelling, "You're done, old man. You're done." Another woman snapped a photo, "Going to make sure the city sees this." Yet not everyone left. A few remained. An elderly woman clutched her purse, her eyes watery and silent. A teenage girl whispered, "That was brave." A middle-aged man in a janitor's uniform gave a slow, respectful nod. Caleb stood at the open doors for a long moment. Then with a heavy breath he stepped inside, his hands bleeding, his shirt torn and smudged with soot and blood. He looked at the few who stayed. His voice, low and hoarse, cut through the silence. "Thank you for staying." No one spoke, but in their silence there was no judgment. Caleb turned, sank back into his seat and placed his shaking hands on the wheel. His white shirt was now streaked with red, clinging to his back. He pulled the lever. The doors hissed shut, and bus number 214 rolled forward into traffic, 1 minute behind schedule. That night, a video of the incident went viral. The flames, the yelling passengers, the man in uniform breaking glass. Some hailed him a hero, others condemned him for endangering lives. But the transit company's rule was unequivocal. No driver leaves their vehicle while passengers are aboard. Caleb knew this. He had accepted the consequence the moment he stepped off the bus. Part 2. The consequence. The transit office reeked of stale coffee and printer toner. It was a place where time crawled, with its gray carpeting, slightly yellowed white walls, and the faint, irritating hum of fluorescent lights. Caleb sat alone on a metal chair outside conference room C. His blood-stained shirt was now clean, though a faint pink tint around the collar hinted at yesterday's events. He wore his best slacks, carefully creased that morning, and held his cap loosely in both hands. His knuckles were still raw from the glass. When the door opened, he didn't flinch. "Mr. Johnson," a firm, emotionless voice stated. Inside, two men sat behind a long laminate desk. One wore a city-issued navy blazer. The other typed methodically on a laptop, not looking up. Neither inquired about his injuries. Neither mentioned the man he'd saved. Their greeting was delivered with the corporate stiffness reserved for those whose fate had already been sealed. "We reviewed the incident," the man with the laptop began. "There's no denying what happened. We've all seen the footage." "Sir, if I could," Caleb started, his voice quiet. "Let us finish," the other man interjected, his eyes not unkind but firm with duty. "You exited the vehicle with passengers still on board. That violates Regulation 6B, subsection 2.3 of City Policy. You abandoned your post. You put passengers at potential risk. Whether or not your actions were well-intentioned is irrelevant." Caleb nodded slowly, offering no argument. "What was the point?" 32 years I've worked for this city," he said quietly. "Not a single complaint, not a scratch on my record, and all it takes is one fire and a decision made in seconds for it all to be erased?" "We're not erasing your service, Mr. Johnson," the first man replied. "You'll receive your pension, but this decision is final, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated." That was it. No handshake, no thank you, just a signature required at the bottom of a form and a small envelope handed to him at the door. Final paycheck and benefit details. Outside the sun was too bright. The world continued its uncaring rhythm, cars rolling down the boulevard. The city he had served faithfully day in and day out, never missing a route, even on snow days, even through riots, even after his wife passed, didn't so much as blink in his direction. 32 years reduced to a manila envelope. He didn't cry. He didn't clench his fists. He simply exhaled slowly, as if something inside him had quietly deflated. He took the long way home. The bus routes he once knew like the lines on his palm now passed him by, indifferent. He didn't wave at the drivers. He knew none of them would stop anyway. Regulations. He walked through the South Side neighborhood where he'd lived his whole life, past the church that only filled for Easter, past the corner store with its flickering open sign, past houses whose porches sagged with age and poverty. His home was a single-story wooden frame with peeling paint and a perpetually squeaky screen door. It wasn't grand, but it had been his and Loretta's dream. She had chosen the siding color, planted the azaleas in the front, now overgrown but still defiantly blooming each spring. Caleb stepped onto the porch and sank into the old wicker chair beside the door. The wood creaked but held as it always did. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, calloused hands clasped like a man praying, but no longer certain to whom. His eyes, once sharp and observant, now stared at nothing in particular. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A siren wailed in the distance. Time stretched out like the Georgia horizon. He should have felt angry, but he didn't. He should have shouted, but he couldn't. There was only stillness, an ache, the slow dawning realization that doing the right thing didn't always save you. That sometimes, no matter how long you stayed in your lane, life could still decide to veer left. The porch light flickered on as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Caleb hadn't moved. Somewhere inside, the refrigerator hummed to life. He thought of the man he'd pulled from the fire. Was he alive? Awake? Did he remember? Did he even know that someone had risked everything for him? Caleb didn't expect gratitude. He didn't want it. But still, there was a hollow space in his chest where something like purpose had once lived. He sat there long after the streetlights came on. Part 3. The unforeseen connection. The next day the world looked the same but felt profoundly different. The rhythm was off. No alarm clock, no uniform to iron, no route to run. The house felt too quiet, too still. He swept the porch, fed the cat that wasn't his but visited every morning, watched the neighborhood kids race bikes down cracked sidewalks. Time moved slowly, thick like syrup. Around 4 p.m. as the light turned golden and shadows stretched long, Caleb sat back in the same chair, a mug of tea in his hand. He wore a clean, plain white shirt, still stung with the memory of yesterday's blood. His forearms were bandaged, the wounds tender but healing. Then he heard footsteps on the gravel path. Not a neighbor, not the mailman. A stranger stood just beyond the gate. Young, well-dressed, out of place in this part of town, and looking directly at Caleb. The knock on the gate came just as the light began to shift, late afternoon slipping into the amber quiet of early evening. Caleb sat in his usual spot on the porch, arms folded, staring into that familiar nowhere he'd been drifting in and out of all day. The footsteps were too steady for a neighborhood kid, too deliberate for a passerby. When he looked up, a man in a sharp gray suit stood behind the fence. He didn't belong here. His suit was impeccable, his shoes gleaming against the dusty sidewalk, his posture upright, not with arrogance but like someone accustomed to being heard. Caleb squinted at him, uncertain, suspicious. The man didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, clutching the fence rail as if debating whether to step forward or retreat. "You lost?" Caleb asked, his voice dry. The man blinked. "Are you Mr. Caleb Johnson?" Caleb slowly set his mug down, his heart instinctively tightening. "Depends who's asking. I work for Mr. Thomas Whitmore. He's in recovery at Midtown Private Hospital. He believes you saved his life." Caleb's posture stiffened. He stood slowly, disbelief washing over him. "He asked if you would come see him," the man continued. "He's not able to travel yet, but he said he needed to see you in person. I have a car waiting." Caleb disliked being summoned. He also disliked feeling indebted. But something in the man's tone wasn't transactional. It was respectful, almost urgent. He grabbed his jacket and followed. The hospital was exactly as Caleb had imagined. Soft jazz in the lobby, indirect lighting, scuff-free floors. Even the elevator timed like a wine glass. They took him up 3 floors and down a hallway that smelled more of expensive hand lotion than antiseptic. The assistant knocked gently, opened the door and gestured for Caleb to enter. The man in the bed was pale, with a thick bandage on his temple and dark rings under his eyes, but he was awake. And as Caleb stepped in, those eyes lit up with something almost boyish. "Mr. Johnson," Thomas said, "you came." Caleb stood near the door, arms crossed. "Didn't plan on it, but your guy made a good case." "I'm glad," Thomas said, then motioned towards the chair beside him. "Please sit." Caleb didn't sit immediately. He scanned the room. Leather-bound books, a state-of-the-art monitor, a bottle of spring water on the nightstand. He shook his head slightly and muttered, "I've never been in a hospital with mood lighting before." Thomas gave a weak chuckle. "Yeah, it's ridiculous, I know. Perks of private insurance, I guess." There was a pause. "I didn't remember it at first," Thomas said. "The crash, the fire. I hit my head pretty bad, but it came back in flashes. I kept hearing your voice. 'Hold on, I got you.' Then I saw the video online. That's when it all clicked." He reached over to the table, picked up his phone and pulled up a paused frame. Caleb half silhouetted in firelight, dragging a limp figure through smoke. "That's me, isn't it?" Caleb looked at the image, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's you." Thomas lowered the phone, his voice softened. "You saved my life." Caleb shrugged. "I just did what anybody should have done." Thomas gave a dry chuckle. "That's the thing, Mr. Johnson. Nobody else did." The silence that followed was thick. Caleb crossed his arms tighter. He didn't like the attention. He didn't trust it. "Why'd you bring me here?" he asked, his voice cool. Thomas hesitated. "To say thank you. And to make you an offer." Caleb's stomach clenched. Offers from men like this never came clean. They were usually wrapped in compliments and delivered like gifts, only to come with a bill later. He stepped forward a few feet. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. "I don't want money or favors. Don't need to be some story you tell your board. So if that's what this is, it's not," Thomas said, hands raised. "That's not what this is." He sat up a little straighter, careful not to pull at the wires in his arm. "I've been thinking a lot lying here about what kind of place we're living in where a man like you saves someone's life and loses his job for it." Caleb's brow twitched. "That video get all the way to you?" "It got everywhere," Thomas said. "Half the city saw it. And while people were arguing about policy and liability, all I could think was how broken this whole damn thing is." Caleb gave a small, tired laugh. "Yeah, city doesn't like heroes unless they follow protocol." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. Why I asked you here. I want you to come work for me. Caleb's head tilted. Doing what? Drive me. Full-time personal driver, Thomas said. You'll have a company car, a furnished apartment in Midtown, full benefits, pay better than transit ever gave you. Caleb looked at him long and hard, trying to spot the catch. You serious? I wouldn't be laying here if I wasn't. Caleb turned and stared out the window. The city skyline glittered beyond the glass. He thought about the miles he'd driven, the years he'd given, the way he'd been discarded. He thought about Loretta, about the mortgage, about dignity. I ain't got a suit, he said. I'll buy you one. I don't know how to be someone's driver. I don't know how to be in your world. You know the city. You know how to move people. That's more than most. Caleb let out a long breath. He felt the internal battle between pride and survival, dignity and distrust. But somewhere in the middle of it all, something small flickered. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just exhaustion. You sure you want to be driven around by a man who got fired for breaking the rules? Thomas's answer came without hesitation. I'd rather be driven by a man who breaks the rules when they're wrong. The words sank into the quiet. Caleb finally turned, stepped forward and looked the young man in the eyes. He saw sincerity there and also fear. But beneath it all, there was something Caleb hadn't seen in years. Not in the eyes of people in suits. Not in the voices of men in charge. Respect. He nodded once. I'll give it a shot. Thomas smiled, extended his hand. Caleb took it and something shifted. Something real. A door opening not just into a job but into something neither of them could yet name. From the ashes of a fire something was taking shape. Part 4. A new voice, a new purpose. Caleb could barely recognize himself in the mirror. The charcoal gray suit, soft to the touch, fit him better than anything he'd ever owned. The silk tie, the crisp white shirt with cufflinks that still felt alien on his wrists. He tugged at the collar again, hoping no one could see how out of place he felt. In the mirror he looked older, cleaner, sharper, but it was an age that lived in his eyes, in the silence between breaths. The car ride was smooth, quiet. Thomas sat beside him, texting one-handed, exuding that casual air that only came from growing up without ever needing to prove belonging. Caleb sat with his hands in his lap, every muscle on alert, like his first day of bus training, only this time he wasn't driving. The venue was glass and marble, towering and glittering, a rooftop overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Waiters moved like shadows, trays of champagne gliding between conversations of men in five-figure suits and women in dresses that looked ripped from magazine pages. Caleb stood still as Thomas introduced him, not to the crowd, but to a few board members and regional developers. Their handshakes were quick, distracted. Their eyes rarely met his for longer than a glance. You're with Thomas? One man asked, his tone laced with confusion. I work for him, Caleb said evenly. As in security driver? The man's smile flickered with polite restraint. Caleb just nodded. That's right. They didn't ask anything else, simply turning back to their wine and shop talk as if he were no longer programmed to respond. Caleb took a seat toward the back of the room, close enough to see but far enough not to be seen. Thomas gave him a reassuring nod before walking to the stage where a wide mahogany table had been set up for the main panel discussion. Caleb's eyes wandered the room. Everyone moved with an inherent ease, as if nothing could touch them from below the 20th floor. Laughter came in smooth bursts. Jokes landed with raised wine glasses. Every word felt curated. Then the topic shifted. One of the speakers, a man with slicked-back silver hair and the voice of a seasoned fundraiser, leaned into his mic. We need to be bold, he declared. This city's transportation budget is bloated. We need to cut redundant human resources, phase out low-density routes and eliminate excessive driver subsidies. A few in the room nodded, murmuring agreement. Another voice added, automation is the future. We can't let nostalgia slow us down. We're pouring money into labor when efficiency should be our guiding light. Caleb's chest tightened. He clenched his jaw, looked down at his lap, then back up at the panel. His hands were shaking, not with fear but something else. That heat, that pressure in the ribs that rises when everything inside you screams, this isn't right. He looked at Thomas. The young CEO hadn't spoken yet, his expression unreadable, but he saw Caleb. Their eyes met. Thomas gave him the smallest nod, a silent, if you need to, go ahead. Caleb stood up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. But the movement caught the corner of people's vision. The room quieted slightly, not out of respect but out of curiosity. He walked slowly to the edge of the audience. No microphone, just his voice. 14 hours a day, he began, deep and steady. That's how long most bus drivers in this city are on the road. Some of them don't get a real break between morning rush and evening shift. You know what they get for it? A folding chair in a break room the size of a closet. Maybe a vending machine that eats their last dollar. Now the room truly stilled. The silver-haired speaker raised an eyebrow but said nothing. No paid sick leave for some. No retirement plans unless they grind 20, 30 years into their backs. You want to talk about cutting driver subsidies? How about we talk about how some of us get paid less than it costs to park in one of your garages downtown? Someone let out a half laugh, unsure if they were permitted to react. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. Caleb continued, his voice low but rising. You call it nostalgia. I call it survival. I've driven every corner of this city. I've picked up women walking home from the hospital on midnight shifts. Kids going to their second school because their first one got shut down. Veterans with no legs but too much pride to ask for help. You want to automate that? A few glances darted around. Still no one interrupted him. You call us redundant. I say we're the spine of this city. You cut that. You think the rest of it'll stand? Silence. Dead silence. Then from the far side of the room a single clap. Soft, slow, then another. And another. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was real. Thomas clapped too, his eyes fixed on Caleb. One by one, more hands joined, some with hesitation, some with something closer to conviction. The silver-haired man looked annoyed, clearly caught off guard, but said nothing. Caleb didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just gave one small nod and returned to his seat. And for the first time in years he felt tall. Not because of the suit or the lights or the view from a rooftop, but because his voice had landed, because truth when spoken right doesn't need a podium. It just needs a moment. Part 5. Transformation. The new office looked nothing like Caleb had expected. No marble, no glass towers, just a clean, sunlit space in a renovated municipal building across from a park. The walls were painted soft gray and the floors were warm wood, not the cold tiles of bureaucratic indifference. Framed photos lined the hallway. Drivers, street scenes, old bus tokens. It smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, the kind of place where real work actually got done. Caleb stood by the window looking out at the traffic rolling by. He wore no suit today, just a button-up shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, and slacks that still bore the shape of a working man's routine. Behind him, Thomas leaned against the conference table, watching him with that quiet intensity he'd grown into since the accident. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. I never thought I'd walk into a room like this, Caleb said at last, his voice soft. Thomas smiled. That's the point. Rooms like this shouldn't just be for people who've never taken the bus. Caleb turned around, the sunlight catching the silver in his beard. His eyes were calmer now, not dulled but anchored. He'd been coming to this office for months, sitting at this very table, speaking not from theory but from asphalt, from sweat, from lived truth. And now today it was official. Thomas stepped forward, holding out a crisp, formal folder. Caleb Johnson, Senior Advisor, Workforce and Transit Equity. Caleb took it slowly as if it might vanish. You're not just here to show up at meetings, Thomas continued. You're here to shape them, to speak for every driver, every janitor, every dispatcher who's been told they're replaceable because they're not. And you're proof of that. Caleb's fingers tightened slightly around the folder. It wasn't the paper that moved him, it was the weight behind it. The fact that someone had finally said, "We want your voice here." Not out of pity, not out of charity, but out of genuine need. They'll look at me like I'm some story, he said. A symbol. Let them, Thomas replied. Then show them you're more. The work started slowly. Caleb listened more than he spoke in the first weeks. He sat through meetings where acronyms flew like darts, where polished executives debated metrics with cold precision. But when the topic turned to real lives, overtime, schedules, shift gaps, burnout, Caleb spoke and the room quieted. When he described what it meant to pull a double on 4 hours of sleep, or to drive through neighborhoods no developer had visited in 20 years, people listened. They didn't always like it, but they listened. Soon Caleb was more than a figurehead. He was rewriting shift policy, helping design better rest areas at terminals, pushing for mental health access and hazard pay. More than once he clashed with middle managers, some of whom still saw him as just a former driver with a lucky break. But when the pilot changes went into effect and driver turnover dropped 23% in 2 months, the murmurs turned into nods. It wasn't flashy work, but it mattered. He received letters, some handwritten, from drivers across the city. "Thanks for speaking up for us. Never thought someone like me would have a voice in City Hall." One note simply read, "I stayed because of you." And through it all, Caleb stayed grounded. He still took the bus sometimes. He still drank his coffee on the porch. He still fed the stray cat when it wandered up. But something in him had settled. Not tamed, just steadied. Then came the ceremony. It wasn't huge, just enough city officials to fill a courtyard, a few reporters, a ribbon stretched across the doors of the city's first hybrid electric bus line. It was part of the new model designed in part from Caleb's feedback. Safer seating, wider aisles, better AC, a reinforced driver partition, and for the first time, emergency buttons that actually connected to people who responded. Thomas stood at the mic talking about infrastructure and innovation, about progress and people. But then he stepped aside and gestured to Caleb. "Most of you know Caleb Johnson as the man who pulled me out of a burning car," he said. "But to me and to this city he's much more than that. He's a reminder that doing what's right isn't always rewarded right away, but over time it shapes everything. He's helped us build something better. Not for press, not for politics, but for people." Caleb stepped forward. The mic felt heavy in his hand, but not foreign. "Not anymore. I never expected any of this," he said. "I spent most of my life behind a wheel driving folks who never once looked me in the eye. I got fired for doing what I thought was decent. And now I stand here not to be celebrated, but to remind y'all that decency is not a flaw. It's a foundation." He looked at the young drivers in the crowd, some of them barely in their 20s. He thought of the long shifts, the breakdowns, the silence. Keep showing up even when they don't see you yet. Then he picked up the shears. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze. He cut it. The crowd clapped, not with the polite applause of boardrooms but with real weight. And in that moment someone called out from the back, "You're a hero, Caleb." He turned, smiled. For the first time in his life he believed it. Not because of a title, not because of a suit, but because he had lived through fire, through dismissal, through invisibility, and had come out the other side, still standing, still driving forward, and now the city would follow. To continue sharing meaningful stories, hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.